And Kysely is not an ORM. Kysely does not have the concept of relations. It is a query builder, which is just some magical TypeScript black magic that I've never seen before. So that entire documentation is here, like in my IntelliSense. Absolutely super useful. Hey, how's it going? This is a quick first impressions video on Kysely, a type-safe SQL query builder for TypeScript. I kind of think of it as like the spiritual successor to knex.js. You can see that it's heavily inspired by that. So in my last video, I had this micro project where we just have an index.ts file and we connect to the database, and then we do some test queries off of that database using, at the time, Drizzle. But this time we're going to update it to use Kysely. For dependencies, you can see that originally we had tsx here, and that allows us to run our index.ts file. And then we have the watch mode in here so that every time we change the code, it's going to rerun. And then finally, we have .env installed. That way we can pull in the database credentials from a .env file. Now you can see that at a glance here, it looks like they primarily support these three packages, pgMySQL2 and Bear SQLite, but they do have support for third-party stuff in here that they're calling dialects. And I already have Postgres.js installed, if you saw earlier, so we're gonna try and use that. Alright, so in the terminal, type that in, hit enter. Alright, so I'm gonna copy some of the usage here just to get started. Let's empty out this interface for now. I'll fill that back in later. And if this is set up correctly, I think the Postgres package here will just read from environment variables my credentials. By the way, from the last video, the database that I have is Postgres 1 from Neon, which is serverless Postgres. And we only have two tables in here, one for user, which has two records in it. It just has an ID and a name. And then we also have a to-do table, which has ID, title, description, and a timestamp. And finally, a user ID to determine who the owner of these tasks are. So my goal right now is to just be able to represent these two tables using Kysely and the interfaces, connect to the database, and then see if we can write some queries to pull this data back. So it looks like what we're supposed to do is basically define an interface for each table, and then we provide those as items within this database interface that we're feeding into Kysely over here. So like I said, we have a users table. Let's start with that. So we'll create an interface user table, and that has a generated ID. So it says that generated basically is for anything that's generated by a database, such as serial auto incrementing IDs. And I think it says that this is so that it automatically becomes optional for inserts and updates, which I think is very smart. Next, we need to add a name column here, which is a string. We also need to create an interface for our to-do table, which has a title, description, and user ID. It seems like from this documentation, you have to match how the naming is on a database. Like if you have underscores in there, you have to write it the same way. I wonder if there's a way to easily transform that as view query to be, camel case like you would expect in JavaScript. Anyways, in our database, let's add user table, to do table. Next, you create your reference to the DB, which is the Kysely object, and then sounds like we can just start running queries off of that. So let's do a db.select from. And you can see that it automatically knows that I can only provide either user or to do. Makes sense. And is that it? Let's go ahead and log our result. Run npm start. So it says that I need to call execute or execute take first. Sure. So I see that it is returning an array with two objects, but it's empty. So I guess it actually wants us to specify what we want to select. I guess personally, I kind of assume that to like select everything if I didn't provide it any other extra fields. So looks like, oh, there is a method called select all. Let's try that. And there you go. There's our expected result of the two users that we have. So I guess that's just a learning curve for me. Let's try selecting just a name. It's interesting that it gives me these 4 different options instead of just 2, but I think that's probably something to do with aliases that we can try later. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. Let's go back to select all. Now where I want to go from here is similar to what I did in the drizzle video, where I want to also select the tasks, the to-dos for each user. So I imagine we need to add a join here. Let's try a left join, and it says I need to provide a table to do. So the second parameter must be providing the on clause. So if we did to do dot user ID, do I just do something like this? Aha. Alright, so there's our result. You can see that it returned a new object per result that we got back, and it kind of merges together all of the fields all in one object. So it's hard to tell what is what. Like if you see in my last video, they actually separated the user object from the to-do object. So in the one object, it was already separated for you and you can tell what was what. Here, it's a little bit exactly like what you'd expect with a SQL query result, right? If you're using like a database client, like it'll just return you a row with all the different columns on it. So it makes sense, but then it's hard to differentiate. Like for example, this ID, what is that ID for? Is that just for the user, or is that for the to-do? Clearly in this case, that ID is for the to-do because we have, and even here it's weird that you know, we have a user that has no to-do items and they just have a bunch of nulls here. So I mean, I guess that makes sense because I did a left join. So if, for example, if we made an inner join here, I think we'll just get back the 3 items. One thing that's a little bit odd to me is that our interface never, remember I left out the created at timestamp column and it's being pulled in here. So it's not like directly using that as the source of truth of what the columns are. It's still kind of pulling everything from the database. So I guess this is really just, as you'd expect, it's just additional information. It's not necessarily a source of truth. It's not like in Drizzle where you create a schema, like an object that defines what are the individual columns, and you can see that you can easily map like the name that you have in the database and, you know, map it to like a JavaScript camel case variable, which is nice. Anyways, getting a little sidetracked here. What's interesting to me is I kind of wonder how did it decide to pull the ID from the to table instead of the user table, because we're doing a select all, which in my mind would have included the user ID, right? I'm not sure if there's just some magic where it knows that, hey, the user ID here would be the same thing, and it kind of just decided that for you. I guess that's an interesting take. I do see in the documentation here where you can add like aliases right in the select here. So I kind of want to see how that works. So let's change this to a select, and I instead want to select user ID, then their name. And then notice that it doesn't know about the to-do because I guess it's above the join. So let's move that down. Let's try if now it does see the to-do. So from like a TypeScript perspective, I kind of can make sense of that. Although it's a little bit backwards to me because if I'm thinking about the SQL that I'm trying to write, usually all the select statements are going to be at the top, right? So it's odd that you kind of have to like reorganize things. So let's do to-do.id and to-do.description. What did that do? So it's still not showing me the user ID. So that part is a little confusing to me. I guess if there's a ambiguity between the IDs, it kind of gets confused. So let's try adding some aliases. So maybe I can do user ID as user ID, and there you go. You can see that the user IDs are now in each of these records, and then I guess it kind of just knows that, oh, this ID has to be the task ID, the to-do ID. Let's go ahead and add a task ID here. There you go. One interesting thing from the result here, if you take a look at the type, you can see that it has user ID and task ID, which is our alias. So there's some kind of like TypeScript black magic happening here where we gave it a string here and it magically sort of, I guess, parses this out and automatically maps it over and then determines what the underlying type for that, right? So like the number in this case. So I think that's kind of impressive. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before. It even knows that task ID can be null, I guess, because like in this example, because we're doing a left join, you'll get a record that has the user but no tasks. So does that mean if I change this to an inner join, that's not going to be nullable anymore? There you go. That is pretty cool. I also really like that they have these methods like execute, take first. If I was trying to do a where clause, what would that look like? Where, let's say user.id. Oh, nice. So it even has IntelliSense for the different operators that you can use. Where user ID is 13. Oh, I guess I was thinking of this like just selecting a single user. So if we got rid of our join here again for a second and our select, and let's just do select all. So I want to select just one user. There's where the execute first makes a ton of sense. That's kind of a really nice method to have. They even have take first or throw. So like what if I provide a random number here, is it gonna throw for me? And it does. No result error. Really nice. That's an API that I don't think I saw in Drizzle. So I guess like in Drizzle you would have to like query, and then if it's empty throw an error yourself or something like that. I'm not sure. All right, what else can we do here? I do like that the IntelliSense is absolutely incredible. You got your usuals like limit and offset, having, you can do combinations of where clauses, like if you were doing where or where. So that's really nice. That seems reasonably intuitive to me personally. I kind of want to actually add that created at and try this column type thing that they have here. It says that you can specify a different type for each operation. Wrapper, here we define a column type that is selected as a date but can optionally be provided as a string in inserts and can never be updated. So that's really cool. So it's like a multi-type. So if we added that here and did I think we had created at, I guess I need to add it to my select here, and there you go. You can see that it turns it into a date object. If I just delete this, does it give me back a string, I assume? Created as string or undefined. That makes a ton of sense to me because just like it was talking about in the documentation, right? If you were querying a date in the application code, you'll probably want to turn that into a date object in a lot of cases if you're gonna do operations against it. But if you're doing, you know, like inserts or updates, usually you would provide like the ISO string for the date, not like the date object. So that ability to kind of fuse the types together is just very, very clever. I also saw in the docs briefly that all the documentation behind all of these are in the code itself. So like you can see when I hover over this, it tells me what it is, like adds a select to the table. And I think if I like do command click here, you can see like where that's coming from. And they have this massive comment block here that has documentation on, this is I think what we were seeing earlier, what it is, and then plus examples, which I just now noticed. I can actually scroll here. That entire documentation is here, like in my IntelliSense. Absolutely super useful, where I can just hover here and it gives me what it is, examples of how to use it, and then it also tells me what's the generated SQL. So far I'm super impressed. Actually, when I first looked at the Kysely docs, I was thinking that, hey, there's not a lot of things in here. Like they had a few examples for how to select, which is probably enough. But yeah, in my head I was thinking like they definitely need to write more docs for people to understand how to use it. But if like the docs is really pretty much in the code and it's reasonably intuitive to find what these methods are, I like that a lot personally. One thing to note is that they don't have a relations API, again because it's a query builder. They're drawing the line there that they're saying they're not an ORM, so they're not going to provide APIs for relations. In fact, if you look up relations on the documentation, they have this like messaging, Kysely is not an ORM. Kysely does not have the concept of relations. It is a query builder. Now what they are saying here is that even though they don't have a relations API, you can still kind of get that nice nesting that you want. Like if, like let's say I wanted to get an array of users, and then within those user objects there's a tasks array that has the individual to-do items. They're saying here that, well, in SQL you could sort of simulate that by like turning things into JSON, and that's how you can sort of like get things nested. And then they talk about how, hey, you can use that idea to create these utilities like JSON array from, and they even provide some of these already for you in the helpers package. So let's go ahead and try this out and see if we can make sense of how it works. So the example here on the right, they have a person table that has, you know, a relationship with pets, it seems like. So it looks like what I'll have to do is basically instead of doing a join, I actually have to do like almost like a nested select query. So let's get rid of all this, and it looks like you can actually provide a specific table here for the select all, which is nice. And then we're gonna do another select here to do our query for the tasks. So EB here is an expression builder. Let's do JSON array from, and then basically we're just gonna select tasks, which I keep saying it's tasks, but really it's to-dos. But I'm saying that a user has one too many tasks, which are to-dos. Sorry if that's confusing. So anyways, we're gonna do a, can I do a select all in here too? To do dot where, and in the example here they're using ref, where to do the user ID is equal to user.id. And then I've got a lot of red squiggly here because I guess I need to provide an alias as tasks, and that got rid of my problem. I guess we could also order by maybe title. Why is it that their example on the right doesn't have execute? Thought you're supposed to execute. But anyways, let's see our result. And there you go. Now we have sort of what I was looking for if we did have like a relations API. We got a user object that has tasks in it. Let's try to select execute and take first. I just want to get that output of the one user with a task so you can see better. There you go. You got the user, you got the nested tasks. So again, if there was a relations API, that's probably like the output that I would expect. And if you watch my previous result video, you can see that they have support for that. So that's, I think, what they're trying to claim, is that it doesn't block you from doing that. Like there's ways around still getting sort of the same result, although it is a little bit more work. And this JSON array from thing is just not intuitive API in my mind. And I don't know that most people would even know that you can do this to JSON thing. But it is an interesting solution, I'll give it that. The one thing I was curious about, what is this where ref thing? I see. So a where ref treats both sides of the operator as references, whereas the regular ref treats the right side as an actual value. I see. So basically they're saying that this side can be a dynamic value, you know, depending on what it is for that specific query, right? Like it's not a hard-coded ID like this. That's why there's also a type error there. So that's pretty cool. But anyways, they do say if this is something that you do often, you can do basically your own utilities in the user land to pull this off, and then you can just use them like this, which is like the cleaner way to do it. But to me, like, I understand that you're trying to be just a query builder, but at least add a relations API. Everyone needs to do relations because it's a relational database. But anyways, that's just my take. I do wonder if, again, because it seems like the owner of this, the person who started this, is the same guy behind Objection. I wonder if he's planning to create an ORM on top of Kysely. Like, I could totally see that happening. By the way, it's probably a good idea to kind of walk through how would you do CRUD using Kysely. So we did selects. Here's some examples for how to do an insert, right? Pretty straightforward. You do insert into, and then values, and then I'm guessing this can also take in an array. Yep, for multi-records. You can see that in more complex scenarios, the values takes in actually a function, and you can do all sorts of things in here. Like you can do a nested subquery. You can even do raw SQL. Speaking of raw SQL, they do have this SQL template thing as well. If you go in recipes and do raw SQL, there's a link here to the SQL template tag. And this is very similar to like what we've seen in Drizzle, where you can just pass in variables in that template string and it'll automatically parameterize it and such. So that's very useful to have. You know, if in the worst case you have to drop down to raw SQL, you have that. Update, similar thing, update table, set, and then your where clause, and then I imagine delete is a lot like that as well. I do want to take a moment to take a look at migration. So you'll notice that in typical fashion, you might have seen this from Knex itself or other solutions like Typescript. You're supposed to define an up and down method, where obviously the up is what runs when you run your migration, and then down, I imagine, is anytime you decide to do a rollback of that migration. It does say that execution order is based on the file names, alphabetical order. It hasn't talked about any way to generate those files for you. That would be something nice to have if they have it. They have some examples here for how to write your migrations. It's very much a JavaScript based syntax, which I imagine has just as good TypeScript compatibility. And they show that they do have this migrator function to actually run your migrations. Want to see how this actually works. So I am going to copy this in the code. Maybe let's create a new migrations folder and let's do a test.ts, and we'll just maybe try the up. Let me perhaps copy this. I just copied over the schema that they have for creating a new person table. So let's maybe clean up our index.ts here and add our migrator thing. What's interesting is our example here says I'm supposed to pass in a path, but this says expected 0 arguments, so not sure what's going on there. I guess the path is probably in the config. So I guess let's provide db in here, and it says I need to give a provider. Alright, so here's how you're supposed to do the file path thing, it looks like. So I'm importing path and also fs, and that's being provided here. Provider, there we go. And this needs to be an absolute path. Migrations, give it a shot. npm start. I probably should have added some logs. I'm assuming that ran already. Let's take a look at our database. So now if we reload our database, there is a new person table here that has those fields that we created, and then also those two migration tables. So this was probably keeping track of, yep, so it's got the file name and the timestamp. So that's how it's gonna figure out. I imagine the next time I run the command, it's gonna say something like no migrations. If I were to run this again, I imagine that it's smart enough to know that there's no migrations to run. The only thing is I wish there were logs here. It should at least tell me something, that something happened, that it succeeded, or there's nothing to run. Again, this is something that from my Drizzle video you can see with the user experience was a little bit better. Alright, so their example here basically just says that if you want some logging, you gotta do it yourself. You gotta check the status and stuff like that, which is okay, I guess. I don't know. In 2023, I kind of expect my migration tools to log these things out for me, but I don't know if that's an unreasonable expectation. Anyways, guys, I think that wraps up my video here for Kysely. Again, this was a quick sort of first impression. Anyways, curious to hear your take. What do you think of what you saw in this video? Would you use Kysely in your project? Let me know in the comments, or if you have any other feedback, let me know as well. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.